The thermometer mounted inside Torsten Haldorson's cabin read 12 degrees above zero, while the one outside his door showed 19 below, and the difference had nothing to do with his fire burning hotter than his neighbors. The band of small, square openings running across his cabin walls glowed with amber light in the pre-dawn darkness, and 50 yards away, Knut Johansen was already splitting his third load of firewood that morning just to keep his family from freezing. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. Torsten Haldorsen stood in the snow outside his cabin on the morning of January 18, 1845, watching his breath crystallize in air so cold it hurt to inhale. The thermometer he had mounted beside his door showed 19 degrees below zero. He opened the door and stepped inside, closing it quickly behind him, and checked the second thermometer hanging on the interior wall. 12 degrees above zero, 31 degrees warmer than the air outside. He added 2 small logs to the fire in his stone fireplace, poured coffee from the pot that had been warming on the hearth, and sat at his handmade table to wait for sunrise. The cabin was comfortable, not warm by summer standards, but far warmer than any cabin had a right to be when the outside air could freeze exposed skin in minutes. The band of wooden slats running across his walls at chest height showed dozens of small rectangular openings, each one perhaps 3 inches wide and 2 inches tall, arranged in perfectly uniform rows that circled the entire interior. Firelight glowed through those openings from the interior, creating a grid pattern of amber light, visible from outside. Torsten had built those slats himself, cutting and spacing each piece with obsessive precision, and they were the reason his cabin stayed warm while his neighbors burned through the cords of firewood trying to achieve half the comfort he enjoyed. They were also the reason those same neighbors had spent the previous fall calling him a fool. Torsten was 34 years old that winter. He had emigrated from Norway to the Minnesota Territory in the spring of 1843 with his wife Sigrid and enough saved money to claim land and build a life in the new country. They had arrived full of optimism about their future in America, about the opportunities available to those willing to work hard and endure hardship. The Norwegian settlement they joined was small but growing, scattered across densely forested land that offered good timber, decent soil, and brutal winters that reminded them of home. They had built their first cabin that summer using techniques Torsten had learned in Norway, methods that had kept families warm for generations in Scandinavian winters. The cabin had been solid. The logs were straight and well-fitted. The corners were properly notched. The roof was tight. The door was thick and hung on good hinges. By every standard Torsten knew, it was a well-built structure that should have protected them through the coming cold. But that first winter had taught Torsten something that nearly destroyed him and would eventually change how he thought about every aspect of cabin construction. What everyone knew about building warm shelters was incomplete at best and dangerously wrong at worst. Sigrid Haldorsen died on March 9, 1844, 3 days after her 31st birthday. The cause, according to the traveling doctor who arrived too late to help, was lung fever brought on by prolonged exposure to cold and damp conditions. Torsten knew the real cause was the cabin itself. He had watched his wife's health decline throughout that first winter, had seen her cough worsen week by week, had felt the constant chill that pervaded their home no matter how much wood he fed the fire. He had burned through their entire winter supply of firewood by February and spent the final month of winter cutting fresh wood in dangerous cold, racing against time and weather to keep the fire burning. The night Sigrid died, Torsten sat alone in the cabin and truly looked at his surroundings for the first time in months. The fire burned hot in their stone fireplace. The door was sealed tight. The single window was shuttered and chinked. Yet cold radiated from the walls as if the logs themselves were blocks of ice. He stood and walked to the nearest wall, placing his palm against the interior surface. The wood was cold to the touch, far colder than it should have been, with a fire burning less than 10 feet away. He looked more carefully and saw what grief and exhaustion had prevented him from seeing clearly before. Ice coated the interior walls, not thick sheets, but a thin crystalline layer that covered nearly every surface not directly heated by the fire. The ice was thickest in the corners and along the wall sections farthest from the fireplace. Torsten scraped at it with his fingernail and watched frost flake away to reveal damp wood beneath. He moved around the cabin, examining each wall section, and found the same pattern everywhere. The solid log walls he had thought were protecting them had actually been trapping moisture inside the cabin. Moisture from cooking, from breathing, from simply living. That moisture had condensed on the cold interior surfaces and frozen, creating a layer of ice that conducted exterior cold directly into the living space. He spent that night and the next day investigating his cabin with the methodical attention of a man who had failed at something critical and needed to understand exactly how and why. He realized that every breath he and Sigrid had taken had added moisture to the air. Every pot of stew, every batch of coffee, every wet garment hung to dry near the fire had released water vapor into the cabin atmosphere. In warmer weather, that moisture would have been harmless. But in deep winter, with exterior temperatures far below freezing, the solid log walls became cold enough that interior moisture condensed and froze on contact. The ice layer then acted as a thermal bridge, conducting cold from outside directly through the walls and into the living space. Torsten buried Sigrid on a hillside overlooking the creek that ran through their property. He marked her grave with stones and carved her name into a wooden cross. He stood there for a long time, looking at the fresh earth, and made a decision that would consume him for the next year. He would understand why proper construction had failed. He would learn what was wrong with methods that generations had trusted. And he would build something better, something that would have kept Sigrid alive. Spring came late to the Minnesota Territory in 1844. Snow lingered into April, and the ground remained frozen until nearly May. Torsten spent those weeks visiting every cabin within a day's travel of his property, asking questions that other settlers found strange. He wanted to see their walls, to examine their construction methods, to understand how they managed moisture and cold. Most settlers thought his questions were symptoms of grief, the wandering focus of a man who had lost his wife and needed distraction. They let him look at whatever he wanted and answered his questions with patience, born of sympathy. Knut Johansen's cabin was typical of Norwegian construction in the settlement. The logs were straight pine, notched at the corners and chinked with moss and clay. The interior was a single room with a stone fireplace on one wall and a sleeping loft above. Knut was proud of his cabin and had built it in the traditional way his father and grandfather had built in Norway. When Torsten asked to examine the walls, Knut showed him the solid construction and tight chinking with obvious satisfaction. But Torsten saw the same patterns he had found in his own cabin. The interior walls showed moisture damage. Dark stains marked the logs where water had condensed and frozen repeatedly throughout winter. The corners, where two cold walls met, showed the worst damage. At Peter Haugen's cabin 3 miles east, Torsten found similar conditions. Peter had added an extra layer of clay, chinking between his logs, and had built his walls thicker than most, using logs 14 inches in diameter instead of the more common 10 or 12 inches. Yet his walls still showed interior moisture problems. The thicker logs and extra chinking had slowed heat loss, but had also trapped more moisture inside. Peter mentioned that he had burned nearly 6 cords of wood over the winter, an enormous amount for a single man in a small cabin. Torsten asked why he needed so much fuel. Peter explained that he could never seem to get the cabin truly warm, that cold radiated from the walls, no matter how hot he built his fire. Torsten visited 8 more cabins over the next 3 weeks and found the same problems in every one. Solid log construction, regardless of how well executed, created interior condensation and ice buildup during sustained cold weather. The moisture came from normal living activities and had nowhere to go. It condensed on cold surfaces and froze, creating thermal bridges that conducted exterior cold directly into living spaces. The colder the weather outside, the worse the problem became. The thicker the walls, the more moisture they trapped. Every cabin he examined had required excessive firewood consumption to maintain marginal comfort, and several families reported illness similar to what had killed Sigrid. In late April, Torsten began experimenting with his own cabin. He drilled small holes through the walls in various locations and at different heights. Each hole was roughly 1 inch in diameter, too small to create noticeable drafts, but large enough to allow air movement. Within days, he noticed the interior walls beginning to dry. The ice layer that had coated the logs melted and did not reform. The cabin felt different, less oppressively damp, despite the continuing cold of early spring. He added more holes, creating a pattern of ventilation points around the cabin perimeter. The improvement was undeniable. Moisture escaped through the small openings, while cold air, being denser and heavier than warm air, did not flow inward with any force. Summer brought warmth and long daylight hours that Torsten used to refine his understanding of cabin ventilation. The small holes he had drilled worked adequately for his existing structure, but he knew they were a crude solution to a problem that deserved careful engineering. He needed to build a new cabin, one designed from the foundation up to manage moisture while retaining heat. The question was how to create controlled ventilation without compromising structural integrity or allowing excessive heat loss. Torsten spent June observing how air moved through his modified cabin. He burned incense near various openings and watched the smoke patterns. Warm air rose toward the ceiling and created slight outward pressure at higher openings. Cool air remained low and showed little movement through lower holes. Moisture, he realized, concentrated at mid-wall height, where warm air from the fire mixed with cold air descending from the ceiling. That middle zone was where condensation formed most readily and where ventilation would provide maximum benefit. He began sketching designs in a notebook he had purchased in the nearest town. His first attempts focused on creating larger openings covered with shutters that could be opened or closed as needed, but adjustable systems meant moving parts that would freeze or fail, and they required constant attention. He needed something passive, something that would work automatically, regardless of conditions or human intervention. The breakthrough came in early July when he was repairing a fence and noticed how the horizontal rails created uniform gaps that allowed air movement while maintaining structural strength. What if he replaced a section of solid wall with horizontal slats spaced to create small, uniform openings? The slats would maintain structural integrity by connecting to the log courses above and below. The gaps between slats would allow moisture to escape while being too small to permit significant convective heat loss. The slat system would be permanent and passive, requiring no adjustment or maintenance. And if he positioned it at mid-wall height, where moisture concentrated most severely, it would address the exact zone where traditional construction failed most dramatically. Torsten refined his design throughout July and August. He calculated that slats 2 inches thick and 4 inches wide would provide adequate strength. Spacing them 2.5 inches apart would create openings large enough for moisture escape, but too small for wind to penetrate effectively. He would need the slats to run the entire perimeter of the cabin, creating a continuous ventilated band. The system would interrupt the solid wall at roughly chest height, replacing what would normally be 3 courses of logs with his slatted panel. In late August, Torsten visited the sawmill 12 miles from his property and placed an unusual order. He needed 68 slats cut to precise dimensions, each one 8 feet long, 2 inches thick, and 4 inches wide. The mill operator asked what he was building. Torsten said he was constructing a new cabin. The operator looked at the dimensions and quantity and asked why he needed fence boards for a cabin. Torsten paid for the lumber and arranged to collect it in 2 weeks. He did not explain his plans. Torsten began construction of his new cabin in early September 1844, choosing a site 50 yards from the cabin where Sigrid had died. The location offered better drainage and clearer sight lines, but the real reason was simpler. He could not continue living in the place where his wife had suffered and died. The new cabin would be slightly larger than his first, measuring 16 feet by 20 feet, with a pitched roof and stone fireplace, but the construction method would differ dramatically from anything his neighbors had built. He spent the first 2 weeks laying a foundation of flat stones set in a shallow trench, creating a level base that would prevent settling. The log walls went up slowly using traditional notched corner construction. He selected each log carefully for straightness and uniform diameter, rejecting any piece that showed significant taper or irregularity. By the end of September, the walls had reached a height of roughly 4 feet, 6 courses of logs, chinked with the clay and moss mixture everyone in the settlement used. Then the traditional construction stopped. Instead of continuing with logs, Torsten installed a framework of vertical posts at 8-foot intervals around the cabin perimeter. These posts, 4 inches square and precisely positioned, would support his slatted panel system. He mounted horizontal backing boards between the posts, creating a framework that connected rigidly to the log courses below. The backing boards would hold the slats and transfer structural loads to the main wall. The slats themselves went up over 3 days in early October. Torsten mounted each piece horizontally, using the backing framework for support. He maintained exact spacing between slats, using wooden blocks cut to 2.5 inches as temporary spacers. Each slat was secured with hand-forged nails driven through into the backing boards. The result was a band of horizontal wooden slats running completely around the cabin at chest height, with uniform rectangular openings between each piece. The openings were small, approximately 2.5 inches tall, and running the full length between vertical posts. But there were dozens of them, creating a grid pattern that encircled the entire structure. Knut Johansen visited the construction site on the 4th day of slat installation. He stood looking at the walls for a long moment before speaking. He asked Torsten what he was building. Torsten said he was building a cabin. Knut pointed at the slatted band and asked why there were gaps in the walls. Torsten explained that the gaps would allow moisture to escape. Knut said that gaps would also allow cold to enter and heat to escape. He predicted that Torsten would freeze to death in his ventilated cabin before winter ended. 2 other settlers who had come with Knut agreed. They called it foolishness and a waste of good lumber. Torsten continued working. Above the slatted band, he resumed traditional log construction, adding 6 more courses to bring the walls to their full height. The roof went on in late October, steep-pitched and covered with split shingles. By early November, the cabin was complete, and Torsten moved his belongings into his new home. Word of Torsten's cabin spread through the Norwegian settlement faster than he had anticipated. Settlers traveling between properties stopped to examine the structure, drawn by descriptions of the unusual slatted band that interrupted the solid log walls. Most visitors studied the construction with obvious confusion, trying to understand why anyone would deliberately create openings in a cabin intended for Minnesota winters. The questions began politely enough, requests for explanation that Torsten answered with simple statements about moisture management and thermal principles. But as November progressed and temperatures dropped, the tone shifted from curiosity to criticism. Knut Johansen became the loudest voice of skepticism. He visited Torsten's cabin 3 times in 2 weeks, each time bringing other settlers to witness what he called a violation of every principle of sound construction. Knut argued that walls existed to keep exterior and interior separate, that any opening compromised that fundamental purpose. He pointed at the slatted band and said it was effectively a series of windows without shutters, paths for cold air to enter and warm air to escape. He calculated that Torsten had perhaps 200 individual openings in his walls, and predicted that heating the cabin would require impossible amounts of firewood. Peter Haugen visited in late November with genuine concern rather than mockery. He examined the slat system carefully and acknowledged that it might help with moisture problems, but he questioned whether the cure was worse than the disease. He worried that Torsten was trading damp walls for an unheatable cabin. Peter suggested that perhaps smaller openings, or fewer of them, might achieve moisture control without such extreme heat loss. Torsten appreciated the thoughtful criticism, but did not modify his design. He had calculated the opening sizes deliberately and believed the system would work as intended. The names began circulating in early December. The settlement children called it the breathing cabin. Some adults referred to it as Haldarson's folly, while others used cruder terms. The most common name was the sieve cabin, a reference to the kitchen tool with dozens of small holes. Torsten heard these names from visitors who repeated them as jokes or warnings. One settler told him that families were using his cabin as a cautionary tale, telling children that this was what happened when grief drove a man to foolish decisions. The criticism intensified as winter deepened. Settlers who had initially remained neutral began expressing doubts. They noted that Torsten's chimney produced steady smoke, suggesting constant fire tending. They assumed he was burning through firewood rapidly, trying to compensate for heat loss through his slatted walls. Some predicted he would abandon the cabin before spring and move into borrowed shelter to survive. Knut Johansen offered Torsten space in his own cabin for the worst months of winter, an offer made publicly and framed as charity for a neighbor who had built unwisely. Torsten declined all offers of rescue. He thanked his neighbors for their concern and continued living alone in his new cabin. He did not explain what he was experiencing inside those walls or mention that he was burning less wood than he had the previous winter. He simply endured the mockery and waited for weather cold enough to prove his design. The first snow fell on November 12, 1844, and continued intermittently through the end of the month. Torsten settled into his new cabin with careful attention to how it performed under actual winter conditions. He maintained a moderate fire in his stone fireplace, not the roaring blaze he had needed the previous year, but a steady burn that consumed 2 or 3 logs every few hours. The interior temperature stabilized at a level he found comfortable for work and sleep, noticeably warmer than his first cabin had ever achieved despite using half the firewood. The difference became apparent within the first week of sustained cold. The interior walls remained dry. No ice formed on the log surfaces, no frost coated the corners where walls met. The air inside felt fundamentally different from what Torsten remembered of the previous winter, less heavy and oppressive, easier to breathe. He realized that the constant dampness he had attributed to normal winter conditions had actually been a failure of traditional construction, a problem so universal that no one recognized it as solvable. The slatted band functioned exactly as he had calculated. Warm air from the fire rose and circulated through the cabin, warming the interior surfaces, including the wooden slats themselves. The slats absorbed heat and radiated it into the small air spaces between them, creating a buffer zone that was warmer than exterior air, but cooler than interior air. Moisture from cooking and breathing rose with the warm air and escaped through the small openings before it could condense on cold surfaces. The openings were too small and too numerous for wind to penetrate effectively. Cold air, being denser than warm air, did not flow inward through the gaps with any force. Torsten began keeping detailed records in his notebook. He recorded daily temperatures when he remembered, noting exterior conditions and interior comfort levels. He tracked firewood consumption and found he was using approximately 3 cords per month compared to the 5 or 6 cords he had burned the previous winter in a smaller cabin. He noted that his clothing and bedding stayed drier, that moisture from wet garments evaporated and escaped rather than condensing on walls and creating ice. By late December, his neighbors had noticed his relatively light chimney smoke. Cabins burning large amounts of wood produced thick, constant smoke, visible from considerable distances. Torsten's chimney showed steady but modest smoke, the signature of a small, efficient fire rather than a desperate attempt to generate heat. Settlers who noticed this assumed Torsten was suffering in cold, rationing his firewood to make limited supplies last longer. Some felt vindicated in their predictions. Others felt guilty, worrying that neighborly criticism had prevented Torsten from asking for help before his situation became dire. No one suspected the truth because the truth contradicted everything they understood about cabin construction. Torsten's cabin, with its hundreds of deliberate openings, was warmer and more comfortable than any solid-walled cabin in the settlement. The slatted band that everyone had mocked as foolish was actually solving the fundamental problem that made frontier winters so dangerous. But Torsten kept this knowledge to himself and waited for conditions extreme enough to make the difference undeniable. The cold arrived on January 15, 1845, descending on the Minnesota Territory with a severity that old-timers claimed they had never witnessed. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero the first night, then continued falling. By the third day, it had reached 35 below, cold enough that trees cracked open with sounds like rifle shots, that water thrown into the air froze before hitting the ground, that exposed skin developed frostbite in less than 5 minutes. The cold persisted for 9 days without relief, testing every cabin and every family in the settlement. Knut Johansen's cabin became a desperate place. He burned wood constantly, feeding his fireplace every hour throughout day and night. His family huddled near the flames, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. Despite the massive fire, cold radiated from the walls with physical force. Ice coated the interior logs in thick layers, beautiful and deadly. The ice formed faster than body heat could melt it, growing thicker each day as moisture from breathing and cooking added to the accumulation. Knut sent his 2 oldest children to sleep in the loft directly above the fireplace, where rising heat provided minimal warmth. He and his wife took turns maintaining the fire through the nights, knowing that letting it die would mean freezing before they could restart it. Other families faced similar conditions. Peter Haugen burned through his entire January firewood supply in the first week and began breaking apart furniture to feed his fire. The Gunderson family 5 miles north abandoned their cabin on the 4th day and moved in with relatives, unable to keep their home warm enough for their infant daughter. Stories circulated of livestock freezing in barns, of supplies ruined by extreme cold, of close calls and near disasters throughout the settlement. On the morning of January 18th, a man arrived at Torsten's cabin shortly after dawn. His name was Johan Vestby, a carpenter from the town of Stillwater, who had been traveling to a work site when the extreme cold trapped him between settlements. He had spent the previous night in an abandoned trapper's shelter and was desperately seeking better accommodation. He approached Torsten's cabin, expecting to find another struggling settler, perhaps willing to share space and firewood in exchange for help with chores. What he found instead confused him completely. Torsten answered the door wearing a single wool shirt and canvas pants, no coat or heavy layers. The interior behind him glowed with firelight and showed no signs of ice or frost. Johann stood in the doorway, feeling warmth radiating outward into the brutal cold, and could not reconcile what he was experiencing with what he knew about frontier cabins in extreme weather. Torsten invited him inside. Johann entered and closed the door behind him, grateful for shelter, but bewildered by what seemed impossible. The cabin was genuinely warm, not the marginal comfort of huddling near a fire, but actual warmth that extended throughout the interior space. He noticed the band of slatted openings running around the walls with firelight glowing through them, and began asking questions that Torsten finally had reason to answer. Johan Vestby was not an ordinary traveler. He had apprenticed with a master carpenter in Norway before emigrating to America, and had spent 12 years building everything from warehouses to churches across the Minnesota and Wisconsin territories. He understood structural principles and thermodynamics better than most frontier builders, and he recognized immediately that Torsten's cabin represented something genuinely innovative. He spent the first hour simply observing, walking the perimeter of the interior, examining the slatted band, feeling the walls, and measuring temperature differences with the scientific curiosity of someone who understood he was witnessing an important discovery. He asked Torsten for permission to conduct tests. Torsten agreed. Johann retrieved a thermometer from his traveling kit, a precision instrument he used for determining proper conditions for glue and finish work. He hung it on the interior wall, away from direct fire influence, and waited 30 minutes for an accurate reading, 12 degrees above zero. He then took the thermometer outside and mounted it in a shaded location protected from wind. 19 degrees below zero. The difference was 31 degrees, a gap so dramatic that Johann initially suspected instrument error. He repeated the measurements with careful attention to placement and timing. The results remained consistent. Johann asked Torsten to explain the engineering principles. Torsten described his observations from the previous winter, the ice buildup on interior walls, the realization that solid construction trapped moisture that then conducted cold inward. He explained how the slatted openings allowed moisture to escape continuously while being too small to permit significant convective airflow. He detailed how the slats themselves absorbed radiant heat from the fire and created a warm buffer zone in the wall cavity, how the system was entirely passive and required no human adjustment or maintenance. Johann understood immediately. He had seen similar moisture problems in other buildings, but had never witnessed a solution this elegant. He asked about firewood consumption. Torsten estimated he was using half the wood he had burned the previous winter in a smaller traditional cabin. Johann asked about interior comfort during the extreme cold of the past week. Torsten said he had maintained his normal fire routine without any need to increase fuel consumption, that the cabin had remained comfortable throughout the cold spell, while his chimney smoke remained modest. Johann asked permission to visit neighboring cabins for comparison. Torsten suggested Knut Johansson's place. They walked the half-mile through dangerous cold to Knut's cabin and found a scene of barely controlled crisis. The interior was filled with smoke from a fire burning too hot for proper draft. Ice coated the walls in layers thick enough to show texture and color variation. Knut's wife was feeding split furniture into the flames. The children huddled in the loft wrapped in every blanket the family owned. The temperature, despite the enormous fire, felt barely warm enough to prevent freezing. Knut saw Johann examining the ice-coated walls and asked bitterly if he had come from Torsten's cabin. Johann confirmed he had. Knut asked with obvious skepticism how Torsten was managing the cold. Johann said simply that Torsten's cabin was warmer than this one, despite using a fraction of the firewood. Knut did not believe him. But Johann's reputation as a skilled carpenter carried weight, and doubt began replacing certainty in Knut's expression. Johann Vestby remained in the settlement for 3 more days, waiting for the extreme cold to break before continuing his journey. He spent much of that time in Torsten's cabin, sketching the slatted panel system in his notebook and calculating dimensions and spacing ratios. He asked detailed questions about construction sequence, material costs, and structural integration. Torsten answered everything freely, explaining that he had developed the system to solve a problem that had killed his wife and that he had no interest in keeping the knowledge private. If the design could help others survive frontier winters more safely, that was sufficient purpose. When Johann departed in late January, he carried detailed drawings and measurements. He was heading to Stillwater, where he employed 4 apprentice carpenters and maintained connections with builders throughout the territory. He told Torsten that he would share the design with others in his trade and credit Torsten as the innovator. Torsten said that credit was unnecessary, that he simply wanted the technique used where it could save lives or reduce suffering. Johann shook his hand and left, traveling east through snow that had finally stopped falling. Spring brought changes that Torsten observed but did not initiate. Peter Haugen appeared at his cabin in April, asking detailed questions about the slatted system. Peter had spoken with Johann during the carpenter's return journey and had decided to rebuild his own cabin, incorporating the ventilation band. Torsten helped him calculate dimensions and spacing for a structure slightly smaller than his own. They spent 2 days together that May working on Peter's cabin, installing the slat framework and ensuring proper integration with the log courses above and below. When completed, Peter's cabin became the second in the territory to feature what settlers were beginning to call Haldorsen panels. Over the following year, 5 more cabins incorporated variations of Torsten's design. Not every settler adopted the technique. Some remained skeptical despite Johann's testimonial and Peter's successful construction. Others lacked the resources to rebuild or modify existing structures, but those who faced serious winter hardship or who were building new cabins increasingly chose to include the slatted ventilation system. The design spread through practical demonstration rather than promotion, each successful installation providing evidence that convinced additional builders. Knut Johansen rebuilt his cabin in the summer of 1846. He did not consult Torsten directly, but hired Johann Vestby to oversee construction. The new cabin featured Haldorsen panels installed at the same mid-wall height Torsten had pioneered. Knut never acknowledged his previous criticism or admitted that Torsten's design had merit. He simply built according to the new method and enjoyed winters that no longer required desperate fuel consumption and constant fire tending. By 1850, the technique had spread beyond the immediate Norwegian settlement. Carpenters working throughout the upper Midwest had encountered the design and recognized its practical advantages. Variations appeared based on available materials and local preferences, but the core principle remained consistent: a band of horizontal slats with small uniform openings at mid-wall height, creating passive ventilation that managed moisture without sacrificing warmth. Torsten remarried in 1851 and gradually shifted from frontier survival to agricultural prosperity. His legacy was measured not in recognition, but in warm, dry cabins scattered across territories where families survived harsh winters through knowledge he had shared freely with anyone who asked.